Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. This is Jim Keddy with Children Now. This is the webinar Follow the Money, a webinar for local groups to engage their school districts. And it is jointly presented by Children Now and the Education Trust West. We're going to go ahead and get started. The webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to have access to that recording following the presentation. The presenters this morning include myself at Children Now, my colleague Rob Manwaring, and then from our terrific partners at the Education Trust West, Carrie Hanel and Raquel Cimental. What you'll find as we go through the webinar is that we'll be using the question box as a way to collect questions as we go through the presentation. And if all goes as planned, we'll have some time at the end of the webinar to answer and respond to your questions. Of course, if you have unanswered questions, we're happy to do with you individually as well. And everyone will be on mute. So in order to kind of manage the technology here and make this work, we decided to only use the question box on your control panel as a way to get input and to respond. So before getting into the parts of today's presentation, I wanted to mention that we've designed this webinar with the hope of meeting a wide variety of interests and needs. We recognize that there are groups and folks out there working on the local control funding formula to advance a variety of strategies, certainly work to advance work in the area of early childhood, something that Children Now is very involved in. A lot of people and organizations working on school climate and health, organizations working on dual language learners, foster youth, the arts, a whole range of issues. And on this webinar, we have a number of local advocates as well as folks working in school districts. So we're hoping that this information is relevant to a variety of needs and interests. We're going to start. We're setting the stage now for today's webinar. We'll go into that a little bit more depth, and we'll give you some updates on the latest state developments. We'll talk about projections and LCFF funding, what's coming down the pike. Share with you some of the work that Education Trust West and Children Now have been doing together on budget transparency, some recommendations on advocacy, and then finally some Q&A time. The Education Trust West, Children Now, and CASBO, the California Association of School Business Officials, our three organizations have been working together in what we refer to as a budget transparency project that this webinar is a part of, and that has two goals. One is to support parents and community groups as they organize to promote equity in their districts. And the second is to assist districts in being more transparent with LCFF dollars and to more effectively engage with parents and community members. So as you'll see later in the presentation, some of the materials we've developed, they have been designed to meet both of these audience, the community audience, as well as the school district staff. Some of the overarching themes that you'll be hearing from us this morning include what is the future of LCFF funding, what new funds are coming to my district, some discussion around the timeline for district decision-making, some recognition of the competing pressures districts face when it comes to allocating LCFF dollars, recommendations on how to advocate for the more effective use of supplemental and concentration funds, and then what's on the horizon when it comes to the various moving parts of the local control funding formula. Okay, so I'm going to be turning this now over to my colleague at Education Trust West, Carrie Hanel, and she's going to share with you on the latest state developments.
Okay, thanks, Jim. This is Carrie Hanel at Education Trust West. I think it's important before we dive into information about LCFF to just frame the conversation about what's happening. And it's difficult to talk about what's happening in California education without acknowledging the test scores that just came out in the last month. The Smarter Balance test results in math and English language arts. And what's clear from the results is that there's still a lot of work to do. In math, 37% of students this year demonstrating that they were meeting or exceeding the standards, and in English language arts, about 48% of students met the standard. And that is better than it was last year. We're seeing some improvement, but we're still seeing that there are wide achievement gaps and that there's a lot of room left to grow. And the reason we wanted to start with this is because while we're talking about LCFF and dollars, we all know that those dollars are in service of student outcomes. And so we wanted to start with a reminder that the ultimate proof will not be how we're spending or whether we can account for each dollar, although transparency is so important, but the proof of LCFF's effectiveness will be in our ability to improve student achievement for all subgroups of students. I'm going to turn it over to Rob to talk about where we are with accountability. And what you'll see as we move into that is that there is an acknowledgement in California right now that achievement means more than just test scores, that the results we're talking about for schools and the way in which we'll determine whether LCFF has worked goes far beyond that. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rob Manwaring from Children Now, to talk about what's happening with our state accountability system.
Thanks, Carrie. So this is an area that's definitely a work in progress, but at the last board meeting in September, the state board took some actions that we'll start to see rolling out as early as January. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that there's a bunch of measures that data will be available on these things starting in January. Some at the state level, and then there'll be some additional at the local level that will likely come next fall. So in that is math assessments, English learner progress. This is how quickly English learners are transitioning to fluency, grad rates, suspension rates, and then a new college and career readiness indicator. And this is definitely a work in progress. That's why it's asterisk, and it's on the other side as well. But will be a combination of test scores and how well kids are getting ready for college, whether they'll be prepared to enter higher ed or whether they've been successful at completing a career pathway of some sort. So it's a mixture of measures. It's definitely still a work in progress, and there'll be a lot of additional information that's tied into that. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there's a whole lot of more work to be done, especially around data collection and analyzing, and then developing specific policies around these things. Why these things are important is that this is the information that should start the process in the fall. A district should be going through what's referred to as a needs assessment, figuring out where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, looking at your test score data, looking at this other data, and from an advocate's perspective, knowing how your particular students that you're interested in or the issue that you're interested in ties into actually impacting these outcomes is a critical leverage point for making the case for whatever particular thing that you're interested in. So, Jim, can you move me on to the next one? So what parents are likely to see in the community might be something like this. There's going to be this grading scale about colors, with blue being the highest color and red being the lowest color, and looking at all these different areas. Each of these measures will be a reflection of a combination of what the performance is in this particular area, take chronic absenteeism, and how much improvement the district has made in chronic absenteeism over the last year. And so you're going to see a combination of colors and a little bit of a look into subgroups that are struggling. And that's what the right-hand side is there. So something like that, the specific display is still definitely a work in progress, but we're going to hopefully see some type of data like this, then hopefully be able to dive deeper into specific subgroups to find out how a particular subgroup that you might be interested in is faring. And in the end, all these will be rolled up to figure out key decisions like identifying districts or schools that need support. So in theory, this is going to work at the district level, at the school level, and also at the subgroup level. And so these reports will help form where the district should hopefully be focusing its budget and planning efforts to address these areas. Obviously, in this one, college and career would be an area, and then there's some subgroups that really need some help. So that's what you kind of get from a page like this. Go ahead, Jim. The other big thing going on is that the planning process is built around developing the Local Control Accountability Plan, or LCAP. And that is about to go through a major revision. In theory, by the November state board meeting, the state board will be adopting a new template. Some of the things that are likely to happen in that, and some of the drafts we've seen and analyzed already, is there's going to be a much better job of explaining an executive summary of what's going on in this district, what are its key things that it's focused on, and how is that going to interact with the outcomes and goals that they're setting for themselves. There's also likely to be a shift to this truly being a 3-year plan. So in other words, right now it's really a 3-year plan that you do annually. This might be a plan that you do only once every 3 years. And if that happens, it's going to introduce a whole lot of things like making out-year decisions based upon contingent decisions, basically based upon what are your expectations for where the economy is going, where Proposition 98 funding is going, and other factors. There's also an attempt to streamline and make this less of a compliance document. And hopefully there's some early signs that the board really wants to link the template to what we were just talking about on the outcome side, so that there's some feedback mechanisms between the plan that you're developing and the findings from the evaluation rubric on how are you doing on the accountability front. There's some things that our two groups in particular have been pushing hard on, that it's uncertain where they'll end up in this final template around fiscal transparency, making sure that districts are clearly justifying when they're using the flexibility of supplemental and concentration funds for school-wide or district-wide purposes. And then fundamentally, this should be a strategic planning process, and so far it's really been much more focused on compliance than strategic planning and figuring out a vision for a district. We're hoping that some additional elements can be done in that area.
We're going to make a little transition. We just heard from Rob and from Carrie about some of what's coming in terms of policy and evaluation and so forth, but now we're going to focus in on what's coming in terms of dollars and growth in budgets. So I'm going to turn this back over to Rob.
First, it's always good to start with getting a historic perspective of what's been going on statewide and how that might be impacting your district. What we see from this graph is that during the recession, obviously funding went down pretty substantially on a per pupil basis, and districts are just getting to the point where they've really recovered from the impact of those recessions. Now, obviously, with our new funding formula, some districts with large numbers of low-income English learner students might be doing slightly better than they did before the recession, while as others with less of those kids may still be finally closing the gap on that. So it kind of puts in perspective that most districts should have righted the ship by this point in their budget planning and really be able to think more strategically about what's their vision for the near future. To help with this, Children Now just did a quick analysis to figure out what funding might look like heading into the next budget. So obviously for 16-17, districts have adopted their budgets and they're up, schools are up and running. But as you start the next planning process for the 17-18 budget, we just did a quick analysis to give you a sense of where that might head. The Department of Finance or the governor's office basically does a projection of what funding is likely to look like in the out years to help districts with their planning. And they're estimating that the main funding source, LCAP, will go up about $2.2 billion, which is, I would put into the moderate category, so not huge ability to do new things. And in particular, right off of the top, districts are going to face a critical cost in increasing contributions to their retirement systems. So about $700 million statewide is going to end up going straight into retirement systems, and that comes off of the top of what districts are getting in these increases. So after you do that and pay for the cost pressures of just basic growth in COLA, there's not going to be a lot left. A key factor, not for the planning that you'll be doing in this year's LCAP, but for the out years, is what is the fate of Proposition 55. Now, this is the extension of taxes that are in what's called Proposition 30, which is basically some taxes on high income earners. So it's putting a higher income tax rate on those earners. Projections are that statewide, this is a highly volatile funding source, but at the same time generates somewhere between $5 and $10 billion a year. So education would be impacted by about half of that. So somewhere in the $2.5 to $5 billion a year extra revenues if this thing passes. And really when you're going to see that hit is in the 18-19 and 19-20 school year. So right now, districts are likely very conservative about their out year budget situation because of the uncertainty around whether Proposition 55 passes. We'll know this in November. If it does pass and it is leading in the polls, that will lead to much better increases in 18-19 and 19-20. The reason this is relevant is, as we were talking about earlier, the state is shifting towards a 3-year planning process. So if you're going to be doing a 3-year planning process and suddenly Prop 55 passes, now you're really talking about the capacity to do some substantial new investments in those out years. Here are some key factors that it will, if you can understand what's going on these fronts, you will be much better positioned to know what is possible in your ask of a district in this planning process. So first, have they been able to restore all the cuts or the major cuts that they wanted to restore from the Great Recession? Have they been able to address structural budget problems? Is their enrollment growing or declining? What kind of commitments do they have that are going to happen automatically? And this is a real challenge in linking budgeting decisions that are going on with this LCAP planning process. A lot of things are on autopilot. So, for example, teachers gain experience each year and their salaries go up because of that. It can be as much as 3 to 4% of a budget going up every single year just because salaries are increasing. There's obviously also the ability to provide additional salary increases at the collective bargaining table. As we talked about earlier, STRS and PERS costs, the teacher retirement and the other educational employee retirement systems, their costs are going up substantially. Healthcare costs are going up. There's some additional requirements to reduce class sizes, and then completing the continuation of programs that they've committed to at this point. So all of these things are taking money off the table for new initiatives. And so knowing what's going on these fronts is really important. Districts are starting in very different places. There's districts like Los Angeles Unified that they're going to face substantial fiscal hardship in the near future because of decisions that have been made in the past. There's districts like San Francisco Unified that really a lot of their increases in the out years have already been committed to existing activities. And then there's other districts, for example, maybe a Fresno that has lots of low-income kids. Their budget's in pretty sound fiscal condition. They may have more opportunity for new initiatives. So knowing where you fall in that camp is really important. I think our message is start early. So if you wait until the district has developed a plan of what they want to do over the next 3 years and start to engage in the spring, the impact that you're going to have is going to be pretty minimal. They're starting the process now, so starting to engage earlier and explain, looking at the data that you're going to get from this evaluation rubric and starting to engage in what you think the district's priority should be moving forward early is the key. We'll know a lot more information. There's on the budget side, on the fiscal side, there's 2 key releases. One is it will be right after the election in November. The Legislative Analyst Office will come out with their forecast of where the state's economy is going. Right now, it doesn't look like it's really that strong moving forward. The state is a little bit behind on its revenues for the year. There's certainly not going to be as much one-time monies moving forward. Over the last 4 years, there's been an average of $3 billion in one-time monies given to districts. That isn't going to happen in the near future. So it's going to be a much tighter budget situation. But we'll know more in November. And then obviously in January, when the governor releases his budget, you'll get a much tighter understanding of how many resources are going to be available. And we'll update that district level analysis as that new information becomes available. But then you see obviously the timeline for formal engagement in the spring, leading to the adoption by July, and then the cycle starting over.
Okay, I'm going to pick this up again. Thanks, Rob. So as you heard, kind of the big message here is the good news is that there are definitely dollars on the horizon, and all of us who have worked to improve schools during the bad budget years and had the experience of trying to hold things together during massive budget cuts. We're very fortunate not to be in that situation. And if Proposition 55 passes, we'll continue to see growth, assuming we don't have a major economic downturn. And then, of course, the challenging news is that there are a lot of competing interests and existing obligations that districts have when it comes to these dollars. What I'm going to be doing now is turning it over to Carrie at Education Trust West, and she's going to be sharing with you some of what she's been seeing and at ETW's been doing in terms of their research on LCAPs and LCFF spending.
Okay, thanks, Jim. This is Carrie again. So EdTrust West has been looking closely at the implementation of LCFF over the last few years. And one of the things that we've been focused on are the LCAPs. And we've been looking at these because they're such a critical part of the LCFF process. This is the point at which community stakeholders have the opportunity to become engaged. It's the point at which the district is sharing its plans for students, including high needs students, and disclosing how they intend to use their dollars. So as a statewide advocacy organization, we've wanted to understand a few things about these LCAPs. One, are they transparent? Are they giving stakeholders what they need? And two, to what extent do these LCAPs demonstrate that supplemental and concentration grants are being directed to the high needs students who generated them? This is such an important part of LCFF. It's designed to rush dollars to the students who are most in need, and we looked at the LCAPs to see if they could tell us that. Our next phase of research is looking at the actual spending. Before I get into the slide, I'll just the LCAPs themselves can tell us about programs and proposals, but the dollars and the way they're actually spent tell us about what districts actually did. So you'll see some research from EdTrust West over the next few months that starts to look at spending patterns. But the LCAPs are important because they help us understand what's happening statewide, but they also surface issues that are very real for advocates who are engaged in these communities. And as we've shared these findings, one of the things we've heard most often is that the data is somewhat affirming. Yes, these are the patterns and trends we're seeing in our communities, and that leads directly to the advocacy strategies that can help kind of remedy those challenges. So one of the things that comes up most often is that the LCAPs are not terribly transparent in most cases in regards to the budget. And for the next few slides, I'm going to be speaking directly to the budget. Most districts account for less than half of their budgets in the LCAP. So if the LCAP is designed to be a planning tool that tells us in one place what the district is doing, it doesn't actually do that, because half of in half the cases, in many of the cases, half the budget is missing. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that some districts report only supplemental and concentration grants in their LCAP. They have built their LCAP to be a plan that describes how they're using that narrow pot of dollars to increase or improve services. Other districts have chosen to report all of their LCFF spending, and LCFF is the largest state revenue source for districts, and so in those districts, the LCAP represents a larger portion of the budget. And still in other districts, they've opted to include all of their budget, or most of the budget, including other revenue sources like Title I funds, Title III funds, local fundraising. And so depending on the district in which you're situated, the LCAP might be a very different document and tell you, give you a different slice of what's happening in the district. And because of that inconsistency, it's often hard to know exactly what the LCAP represents. And so one of the suggestions we've made with the LCAP revision, and something that districts can do already, is just disclose what the LCAP is, what funding sources are included and why, and help stakeholders make sense of it so they know what they're dealing with. On the second slide, we surface another set of challenges, which is around the supplemental and concentration grants. And we know that for many of you who are specifically working with foster youth or English learners or dual language learners or low-income students, that the most important piece that we focus on in the LCAPs is the use of supplemental and concentration grants, and more generally, how they're using dollars to increase or improve services for those students. And the reality is that in most cases, it's still not possible to tell whether those grants are being used to increase or improve services. There are a few reasons for that. One is that many districts are still not disaggregating their supplemental funding from their base funding. They're including large line items for LCFF funding and not making it clear which ones are actually designed to increase or improve services and which ones are using supplemental and concentration. There are districts who do this very well, though, so I want to acknowledge that it cuts both ways. So just for a few examples, there are districts like Santa Rosa High School District, Oakland Unified, that do a nice job of showing specifically what they're doing with their supplemental and concentration grants and getting really specific. So it's not enough just to show the dollars, but also to convey, as Santa Rosa High School District did, that it's hiring 5 bilingual counselors to provide case management for foster youth and English learners. Or as Oakland did, that it's hiring 6 full-time summer school teachers to assist newcomer refugees with language acquisition. That kind of specificity is really helpful for stakeholders who are getting engaged in the process, who care about the programs and services. The dollars are really helpful entry point, and it enables us to ask questions, but ultimately what's going to benefit kids are the programs and services themselves. And then the other point of confusion and concern that arises in many of these LCAPs is that despite the promising practices I just shared, there are cases where districts appear to be using funds in ways that are contrary to the spirit of the law. For example, there are districts that are using supplemental and concentration grants to provide special education services. So essentially supplanting funding sources that they had previously used for those students, rather than increasing or improving services above and beyond the special education services to which all students are entitled. We also have seen instances of districts using large swaths of supplemental and concentration to increase salaries across the board, to provide maintenance, or to just maintain the general quality of the program without increasing or improving. But the tricky thing about this is that the instances where we can see this happening is where districts have opted to disaggregate their supplemental and concentration grants. And so what we want to encourage here is that there still is that transparency in that disaggregation, and that there's the justification of why those uses of funds are appropriate for low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. We don't mean to imply that you ought to back away from transparency, because if you do become transparent, it's easier to find these things. So it's a catch-22. There are many great examples of districts that have been both transparent and thoughtful in how they comply with the spirit of the law. And then the last issue that we have noticed in our review of 40 LCAPs is the issue of underspending supplemental and concentration, which is on the next slide. And we find that many districts, indeed most districts, are underspending supplemental and concentration grants relative to what they proposed. And we see this by comparing the proposal from one year to the annual update from the next year. And in the annual update of the LCAP, districts are telling us how they have spent their funds. And when we add up the numbers and compare them, often cases there's supplemental and concentration funding left on the table. These are just a few examples of districts where we found that. The truth is that in most districts we find this. There are many reasons this might make sense. For instance, They may have proposed to hire 6 counselors and only found 5. They may have started a program later in the year. But the real question is, how do we ensure that those dollars still go to the students who generated them, rather than being rolled back into base funding that's then spread across the district? Unfortunately, there's not a lot of state guidance on this, and we have urged the state to provide clear guidance around the restrictions on the carryover of supplemental and concentration funds. Something that we have not heard that there's additional guidance on yet, and we believe is going to be really important if we can get to some clarity and assurance and protections for those dollars for our highest needs students. Okay, Jim, I'm going to turn it back to you to transition us to talking about advocacy from here.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Thanks for sharing all that terrific research. So we're going to transition now to Carrie's colleague, Raquel Cimental, and she's going to share with us some of our thoughts in terms of how advocates can get into the conversation and influence the direction of LCFF spending. And as Rob mentioned earlier, one of the big points we want to make is the need to start early, which is why we're holding this webinar in September and encouraging folks to get ahead into the very early conversations about LCAP development and not to wait until the district's formal processes that take place in the spring. Okay, so I'm handing this over to Raquel.
My colleagues have done a great job kind of taking us through the changes, the landscape, the competing pressures, how an increased transparency helps both districts and community build stronger partnerships. What I intend to cover here are the opportunities that anyone can leverage, no matter where you sit in the LCFF engagement process, to increase budget transparency and foster an effective partnership between district and community. And oftentimes, transparency and clarity starts with asking the right questions so everyone is in a better position to engage. And so what you have before you are a list of questions that we think lead to more transparency around budgets and resources, puts everyone on a level playing field, so to speak, so that everyone can better engage. So the first question we have here are, what are the new dollars coming to the districts through LCFF? And of those funds, what is base versus supplemental and concentration? So this is where I like to remind advocates and districts about the importance of breaking it down, right? Breaking it down so that everyone understands what we have and how much we have, what funds can be used to serve all students, and what funds should be going to high need students. After all, if advocates can't see the full picture, it leads to local confusion and not local control. Likewise, of these dollars, what is unallocated? Rob talked about the competing cost pressures that districts are grappling with. And this reminds me of the rapper MC Hammer. Can't touch this, right? This underscores the importance of being crystal clear of what funds are allocated, can't touch, and what funds are unallocated, and are the funds available to have a dialogue around what would be the best and effective strategies that target our high needs students, improve services, and increase programs. To what strategies and programs is the district considering for unallocated supplemental and concentration funds? So in other words, share what you're thinking. Everyone share what they're thinking. We've heard from advocates in many communities about how helpful it is to hear from the district about how it's thinking about using unallocated supplemental and concentration funds. And as Carrie pointed out earlier, the more specific, the better. Some districts are doing a really good job about being very specific in their LCAPs about where they're using the unallocated supplemental and concentration funds. And for advocates, the LCAP process presents an opportunity to have that dialogue about what programs and services they are thinking would be most impactful and closes opportunity and achievement gaps for our high needs students. How effective are the programs currently being funded? This is the appropriate time and place to talk about the programs that are being funded. Are they evidence-based? Are they programs that were eliminated during the Great Recession and being restored because it was there before, and so we're just bringing it back? LCFF presents a unique opportunity to do things differently, to be creative, to be innovative, instead of maintaining the status quo and resurrecting what was there before. Finally, be proactive. what are your recommendations? As I mentioned, the LCFF engagement process presents that opportunity for advocates to state what they want and have a dialogue with the district. Oftentimes, we've talked to local advocates about how the process is going, and they express concern about programs that they don't feel should be funded, that are being funded, and I stop and ask them, have you recommended something different? Are you being clear about your recommendations? Are you being proactive and sharing your recommendations first instead of waiting to hear what comes from the district and then saying that's not going to work? So being proactive for advocates is this engagement process really it is an opportunity for you all to come out the gate with some recommendations. Asking the right questions is a great first step. But there are other ways that advocates can get traction with LCFF engagement and champion equity. After all, this is the LCFF. We all advocated for LCFF because we know it holds the promise of closing opportunity and achievement gaps, and that's something that we all want. And so here we have some other ways to get traction and ways to champion equity. Our board members, our school board members, oftentimes we forget that they can be equity champions for us. And they, after all, represent the community. They want to ensure that their district is working towards a plan to closing opportunity achievement gaps. So talk to your school board members, engage them, let them know how the process is going, or if the process is going well or not well. And what we're also seeing is that the LCFF engagement process has built the capacity of a lot of local advocates, and they're now thinking about, or many of them are running to be on the school boards. And so we think that's really great, getting the experience and engagement in the LCFF process, how that then is relevant and useful as a school board member. Leveraging the parent advisory committee requirements. If you're not familiar, some of us are, there are stakeholder engagements that are required, the parent advisory committee being one of them. And for districts that have at least 15% English language learners, they must also be engaged in a separate committee that includes parents of English learners. And these meetings must be open to the public, so advocates can use that process, those committees, to take the recommendations, find a friend that's on the parent advisory committee, work through them, meet with them, show up to the meetings, and engage on that level. Also, recruit other allies to support your recommendations during the LCAP process. Build coalitions and collaborate around shared goals. Share information with each other, because working together is the only way that we can close opportunity achievement gaps. The more groups that advocate together with a unified message, the more impactful and effective that will be. Be persistent and consistent. Rob shared the timeline. We know that the process starts very early and goes through the seasons, but this isn't a one touch and done. This is needing to engage at the various points. So be persistent, be consistent, and that is how we can be more effective in our partnership and engagement. Thank you, Jim.
Great, thank you, Raquel. Okay, now we're going to just share with you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing to help districts present information about LCFF and LCAP in a way that's more transparent. We've developed some tools that you can find on the Education Trust West website, as well as the Children Now website, of recommendations on best practices, as well as a PowerPoint that districts can use, and you can ask districts to use in sharing information. And these are just a couple slides from the PowerPoint that we developed for district staff. This is a slide where districts kind of lay out where their existing commitments are, so there's transparency around dollars that are going to healthcare benefits, salary increases, and then showing districts kind of what's remaining. And then this is a slide that we developed where district staff can show of the dollars that are unallocated, what are the plans for those dollars, and how do those break out in base funding versus supplemental concentration.
Yeah, so we mocked up the slides that are in the budget toolkit Jim just shared to show what we think is a best practice, which is the way in which a district could connect its goals and its priorities to its spending in a really clear way. There are other ways this has been done. And you might also be interested in just looking around at what other districts have done. I'm going to show a couple of examples, not as best practices or promising practices, but rather just as ideas. Oakland Unified has put its entire chart of accounts, its budget, on its website for stakeholders to browse through. They can filter by funding source. They can drill down to each school site to see how much money has been budgeted and how much has been spent. One way this could be pushed probably is to provide more description of the program and service rather than just the dollar amount. But I think there's something here in that they're opening things up and allowing people to access the data directly. And then in the next example, this one is from Fontana Unified, but there are many others that are similar to this. Many districts are creating infographics and flyers that describe a little bit about the district budget for stakeholders. This is very different in that it conveys some very high-level information, whereas Oakland's conveyed very granular information. I just throw this out here as an example to say if this is a kind of thing that's missing in your community that you might find helpful, you could show these sorts of examples to your district and ask whether something like this might be feasible. Again, the example that's from Fontana up on the screen there's a lot that's not here. It doesn't show school site spending. It doesn't show a lot of detail about the programs and services, but it's an example of what that top level dashboard might look like and what your district could do if it's not already doing that.
Yeah, so then just finally wrapping up now in developing these tools, what we are encouraging folks, both school districts and the advocates on the call, is to take a look, see if this budget PowerPoint could help you in terms of being clear, more transparent around the trade-offs and the planning that's underway for future LCFF dollars, and then to look for examples and promising practices from districts that are leading the way. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move into questions, and I have been working to keep track of a lot of terrific questions. And forgive me if we're not able to get to all of them in our remaining minutes. But one question we had, which I thought covers a lot of ground and is certainly a challenge I think a lot of people are facing, is how can advocates respond to districts that are using large sums of supplemental concentration funds for district-wide raises or school police and feel like they are justified in doing this since they are a majority low-income district? This is a challenge I think that many people are raising. I wanted to see if Raquel, if you had thoughts on that, and then maybe we could go over and see if Rob has any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm going to ask Carrie to also help here, but I think we have been hearing those concerns from many communities. I think that the level of advocacy in those communities and engagement is really kind of concentrating on addressing those very specific situations. Carrie, I don't know. I know that maybe Carrie can speak to some of the challenges that organizations that have legal arms are kind of taking a look at these LCAPs and expenditures. Carrie, I don't know if you have any insight on
the thing that needs to be done in these cases is that there needs to be a clear justification for why that use of funding is appropriate. And the LCAP template doesn't guide districts to justify each individual use of supplemental and concentration funding. So that's one thing that the state could remedy. It's something that advocates can push on, that there be individual line item justifications rather than some kind of omnibus justification at the end of the LCAP. Some of the examples that you threw out, Jim, are not categorically disallowed. There might be instances where, say, campus police could be justified, but the burden of the justification rests on the district in partnership with its community. The other thing that I think the other lever is the county office. The county ultimately provides assistance and support to the district and approves the LCAP. And so I'd say that making the case to the county and ensuring that the county is looking closely at these things could be another course of action.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Rob, do you have any reactions to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take a different angle on it. I would suggest that one of the ways to start is look at the data. So what Carrie and I see statewide as we look at this data is we see achievement gaps that are actually, if that's happening at your local level, that's probably the biggest leverage tool you have to stop these type of things from happening. Is saying, look, the strategy that you've been employing with your supplemental and concentration dollars isn't fundamentally closing achievement gaps. You need a better strategy that's focused on closing achievement gaps, or you need to explain to us how this proposal for use of these funds is going to close achievement gaps, because we're not seeing it. And obviously we just have data, really good data on test scores right now, but we're going to have that same lens on grad rates, on suspension rates, to say that we need better restorative justice practices, or whatever your particular area is. Focus on those outcomes and the gaps that are happening in those outcomes, and put the district in a position of explaining to you how their action is going to address this issue.
And I think, Rob, the key word there is how it's going to increase or improve services. And the thing that I think we've heard a number of times is if you're just spending more on the same service, you're not increasing or improving services. So if you are not doing anything differently with teachers, but you're now paying all of them more, how is that going to increase or improve services? The argument could be made that in exchange for the increase, we're doing a different kind of professional development, we're hiring better staff. I mean, there might be an ability to justify, but there has to be that link to increase or improve services.
Great, thank you, Carrie. I just wanted to chime in on this too and go back to the points that Raquel was making earlier, that this does ultimately come down to power and influence, and we really want to encourage local advocates to get involved early and to seek out and develop champions on the school board who are able to raise these critical questions, as well as champions within the district staff. And I think when school district folks see organized parents and organized communities raising these kinds of questions, it does result in a shifting or a change in the conversation, and ultimately over time, what we would hope is we see, greater equity and more attention paid to achievement gaps. So let me go and take a question. We had a couple questions popping up earlier in the presentation around the LCFF evaluation and where that's at. And one question had to do with where does social emotional show up in the current LCFF evaluation that's under development, as well as chronic absenteeism. Do you want to, maybe Rob, could you address that?
Sure. So chronic absenteeism is the easier of those two. It will be, they're collecting data statewide for the 16-17 school year on this. And so so by next fall, we should see the first clear statewide picture of where is your district and how does its chronic absenteeism rate compare with others. So that one's the easier one because there's already a plan in place. On the other issue, what is required this school year is that districts explain how they're meeting the requirement to survey students, teachers, and parents. And so really working with your district to ensure that those surveys are of high quality, and that you're going to get some of the impact on the specific areas of social emotional development. In addition, the there's a set of districts called the core districts. These are mostly large urban districts, but they represent about 30% of kids right now. They're really experimenting with better measures of social emotional development. So I don't see that type of work coming statewide for a while, because even nationally, this is a relatively new area. So specific measures of social emotional are likely to be more on survey and chronic absence suspension rates than specific measures of social emotional. But I mean, for the 30% that are playing in that pilot, there certainly could be some more information, and hopefully we're going to learn from their work, so that over the next 5 to 10 years, this becomes a statewide thing.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. In order to stay on time, I'm sorry to say that we're not going to get to all the questions that were raised, but I did want to let you know what our next steps are. So you will be receiving an email from us, everyone who has been everyone participating, with a link to the presentation. And on behalf of Children Now, and on behalf of our terrific partners at Education Trust West, we want to thank everybody for taking the time, and also to thank you for all the work that you're doing, whether you're a local advocate or a district staff person, and working hard for our students here in California, and for working to fulfill the promise of LCFF around equity. So with that, we're going to sign off. Hope you'll be able to join us in a future webinar. We intend to continue to send out information on LCFF and the work that we're doing in the months that come. Okay, thanks everybody.